Tonight's news is brought to you through the combined sponsorship of Reality and Local Conditions, one being the parent company and the other a division thereof. They both, however, continue to be infinite candidates for a takeover by an even larger operation, as also is your awareness, if you but knew it. And now the news. In the beginning, for breakfast, the earth ate the stars, then for lunch, the sky, then for dinner, the atmosphere, and afterwards burped, and out came man. Now each man must repeat the process for himself, in himself, concluding with the personal reproduction of himself. To avenge the murder of his friend, a man decided to extract justice for himself, then pondered whether to kill the murderer and be done with it, or to shoot him in the knees and cripple him for life. With a stiff brush, try applying this to the present contents of your mind and their possible eviction. If your mind stays fixed on conditions, it plays jacks, hopscotch, and sings nursery rhymes. What adult expects to awaken under these conditions? Surrounded by the waves of radio, television, and other city communications, a certain man realized to watch the news now that my hero is dead would be unacceptably disrespectful. With the same stiff brush, try applying this also. One day a boy paused and pondered. All of the myths from all of the times and all of the places could be melted down to a single story. That of a man struggling with some stupendous force. To me, that is quite clear. But what does it mean? When he needed, this one man would use the ideas of others and make them work, even though they weren't originally workable. An artist who periodically gets serious is good for civilization, but bad for entertainment. Stupidity is not as simple as most assume, for it is always dual, binary, twofold, and duplicate, never just one thing. Above the entrance to the Mystics theme park is a sign warning, "Abandon everything, all ye who enter here, save for one." Life in Cityville with just plain folks. The millionaire mayor addressed the people. "I believe that every advantage implies an obligation, every success a humbling, every privilege a responsibility, and every possum a duty." And his speechwriter muttered, "That's possession." A certain man, desirous of extending his own consciousness, sought the counsel of one purported to have already done so, and asked him, "Can emotional pain and sorrow be put to some practical use?" And the other replied, "Indeed. If you cannot use whatever comes your way, you do not even deserve the description desirous of." Rudimentary mystics have been wont to put stones in their shoes for a certain purpose, while more realized ones simply let life do its business to the same end. One man got so stuck in this reality that he multiplied. And those who came after asked him, "Is that you? And us too? And are we one and the same?" Today's alien invasion story. A visitor to Earth, after touring several large libraries, finally said to his host, "Now I want to be perfectly clear on this. Everything Everyone uses the same group of words, and everything I see around us now is simply different variations thereof. And a passing mathematician who happened to overhear this attempted a self-satisfied chortle to himself. Justice. Men beat up on their minds, and their emotions beat up on them. A man once asked an omelet, which came first, the whisk or the mixing bowl? Math. If you divide up man into enough pieces, you can prove anything. Tests. The more conscious have nothing to prove. And the teacher said, one man's stomach was stronger than his mind. So were his arms, his legs, hell, even his sex organ was stronger. So tell me, boys and girls, who was this man? And they all cried out, it was us! Oh, it will surely be us someday. For the neural warrior, with any situation, there is but one kind of useful analysis, and it is always instant and always complete, every time it's done, and redone, and done again. Everyone knows a lot poorly. The awakened know one thing well. Freedom. We are all more or less slaves of slavery, captives of captivity, and call it freedom. As the land of the new people began to germinate, they placed a sign just outside the settlement that said, we are born what we are, but for the people to grow, the sign had to go. Life gave man mirrors so that he wouldn't look at himself too directly. Life later changed the name of mirrors to minds. A man cried out, help, I'm drowning in reality. And a voice corrected, not reality, local conditions perhaps. A man finally thought, what is there to criticize in the drama, the life of man? You hold a soccer game, and only soccer fans show up. If the life of the ordinary is like the reading of a novel, then the more awakened would be those who, should they talk about it, would give away the ending and ruin it for everyone else. Remember, someone told their child, no matter what you say in praise of man, no matter what you say condemning him, remember, man is the only one who says anything about man. A fellow visited a mystic and asked him, what does it mean to be awakened? And the mystic said, can you picture living in a house completely lit by a 20-watt bulb? And when the man replied that he could, the mystic went on. Then imagine discovering that it could be 100 watts. And as the man gleefully began nodding his understanding, the mystic raised his hand saying, no, wait. Now picture going out of doors and finding the universe lit by an infinite number of suns. Local science. Recent city determinations prove conclusively that no man's mind was ever a universe. The loss of a friend is the loss of a lung, since we breathe as full humans through a network. The loss of awareness is the loss of oneself. Reaffirmation of things you can count on. You can count on the healthy eventually resenting the sick, and sometimes the living the dead. Men who believe that human emotions are strictly human are not yet themselves fully human in their comprehension. And now, facts you can count on. The truth gives everyone the blues because it's so, well, so impermanent. If you base knowledge on statistics, two things become apparent. That everyone knows what's going on and that no one does. Only one thing would give a mystic ulcers, trying to tell the truth where there is none. Fame in the city, as described by one local. Around here you're nobody till somebody's done an expose on you. After many years of catching bricks and throwing bats, one man switched over to catching bats and throwing bricks. It later struck him that the fact that you can play around with words is proof that you can, and perhaps should, play around with the mind. Neither Cooperstown nor Indianapolis would confirm this. An old man sitting in the park said to a pigeon, "I'll tell you another way that things have changed. People use advice today the way they used to use gossip." And the bird shook its head and thought, people his age shouldn't stay with themselves so much. Then, just to keep things interesting, it meowed. The only news reported is the obvious, but no one ever notices. The mind attempting to manipulate consciousness is like a rope trying to push a car uphill. Revised emotion, to the mind more connected, creativity. Those who think merely by the mind from an unchanging menu must dine. A true mystical warrior always holds something in his memory that he deems of such value and honor as to be near sacred, so that the temptation to let crude emotions overtake the mind and usurp and replace the object, even momentarily, becomes for him unthinkable blasphemy. Continuing with the use of the term mystical, that's what all of this is about, and to freshen up your memory that besides the use of mystical as an adjective, or mystic as an adjective, or mystical, it is also a noun, a mystic, and it is, to clean up some of the thousands of years of translations, but this is more or less what even English lexicons would agree with. A mystic is someone who believes, professes, would you buy knows, but at least professes, believes in, supports the idea that there is knowledge available that transcends, or there's insight, understanding that transcends ordinary knowledge. Now, throughout history, I'll grant you that there are other definitions in a large dictionary under that one, and they very quickly bring in their own adjectives, their own modifiers in the definition, the primary one in English being spiritual. So it always has that connotation. I might also ask you, en passant, is why does the human mind, and those who speak English also are privy to a human mind as far as I know, why do they take a word and they already give the definition as having to do a mystic, a person who believes in the possibility of insight or understanding that transcends, is outside of ordinary knowledge? That one definition, and that's a fair one, I'm sure, from number one under noun, Why do they immediately follow that up? And why is it so common when you hear mystic to put in spiritual? That the next definition, right under that one in most dictionaries, in some way or the other, it will get into someone who believes, someone of a spiritual nature, someone of a spiritual bent who believes that there is knowledge available through some sort of spiritual means. How does the man start out, or why, if you'd like to analyze it, and if you can't do it instantly, we'll move right on. Why does the mind insist, as soon as it says something about the idea of knowledge, the possibility of some understanding transcending the ordinary form of knowledge, then immediately, although I know in print it doesn't look that way, but it's almost as though Senior Johnson's spirit is still there, or Mr. Webster, that wants to go, oh, wait a minute, don't stop there, don't close the page here, read on. So immediately after that, it brings in spiritual. The reason I'm going through all this, which was strictly a side trip, is even as though the dictionary, which would appear to be as cold, calculating, heartless, unbiased as is possible, right? What could you ask for that is less biased and prejudicial in any way than a dictionary? What does it care? It just states the facts. And even it cannot let go at the possibility, and it doesn't even say it's true. It doesn't say the mystical. Knowledge gained outside ordinary channels, or insight gained outside of transcending ordinary knowledge. It won't even go that far. It says a person who professes. So that would sound as though that the dictionary, that is, that the human language, had covered its own backside. But it won't even rest there. There's nothing in the first definition having to do with spirituality. It is just cold, hard facts, cold, hard theory, but based on intellectual matters. It says a person, first definition, or one of them, would be a person who believes in the possibility of understanding transcending ordinary knowledge. That says nothing about spirituality, religion, emotion, but nothing about spirituality. And then they'll come right along definition number 2. Or it could be vice versa, according to how much you paid for your dictionary, I guess. But there will be another definition that will throw in the modifiers. They may change the sentence a little bit, but it says basically the same thing, but it throws in the idea of spirituality. To save you the trouble of analyzing it yourself, since you already paid to get in, I'll go ahead and point out to you, it is, as always, it is the ejection point where life created Ken and Barbie. It's where the mold was injected all the plastic. It is the trap door. It is Pandora's box in reverse. It is the way out. Because even once the dictionary says there are people who believe in the possibility, and it doesn't say they're crackpots, it doesn't say anything. It just goes along like a dictionary should. Nice, plain, prosaic, unemotional, mystic. A person who believes in the possibility of understanding and insight that transcends ordinary knowledge. And that goes up. And that throws in spirituality. And it eats up the first definition, because what it does is dismiss it. Not real overtly. If you're a mystic, an ordinary weekend drugstore kind of unrealized mystic, and you happen to read that, you could dismiss the first one. But assuming that you're the sort of person that would sit there and read, let's assume you're an ordinary intellectual even would-be mystic, as soon as you read the second one, it dismisses the idea. Even though it does it, I'll admit, in a subtle manner, it dismisses to ordinary people the first definition. That is to say, a mystic, someone who believes in the possibility of knowing things that's outside the normal bounds. An ordinary person, ordinary sophisticated, educated person throughout history. We go on the edge, and you go, and also. And what it does then is throw it into the category of whatever you prefer, New Age, UFOers, spiritualists, crackpots of all description. That is, by saying spiritual, it dismisses it from a strictly intellectual view. All you have to do is put that in. And if you don't like my term of dismiss it, it gives you a way out. That if you were wired up to be more intellectual than emotional, spiritual, tending toward things obscure and mystical, then that is the way to dismiss it. Whether you put a particular name on it or not, whether you turn it into a pejorative phrase, at least when that's pointed out that belief and knowledge, we're talking about now the archetypical person would have been who's pursued normal routes of education, has a logical mind as they call it, and they hear again or read again a mystic, someone who believes in the possibility of understanding and insight that transcends ordinary knowledge. And here's a person who had spent all their life, they still work crossword puzzles, still go to night school, still go to the library and read books, attend lectures. They've spent 40, 50 years in the ordinary pursuit of knowledge at the highest possible level. And then to hear that there are people who believe that there are things that you can just know like through direct intuition, just things outside. How can you live with that? So the second definition is throw in spirituality, which from that kind of intellectual street level view, spirituality is an anathema to intellectualism, to logic. And they're not wrong, that's the way it's supposed to be. But our lengthy side trip was, no one ever seems to notice, what is the mind at time, or life through the mind, will almost seem to go, you want to dance? Or, hey little girl, would you like a cookie? And you think, hey, like an extraordinary cookie, like the word mystical. And you start to go, boy, that sure does sound tasty, or it sure is attractive. And suddenly you feel like here's some sort of idea that pulled up in a dark sedan with tinted windows, and it's a guy in an overcoat, and he's saying, would you like this? And of course, the idea of danger and the forbidden almost gets you. You want to go over and see what it is. But before you can, run amok. It reveals itself. It exposes itself in the allegorical sense, that is, the intellect itself, the mind comes back around and says, oh, that's a dream, because it's spiritual. Back to the main road. The idea of the mystical has been called all of these things that we've mentioned before, and I threw into a news item last time. The perfection of knowledge, the perfection of oneself, even the awakening, the enlightenment, the reunion or the union with the divine, the immersion with the cosmos, the joining with the universal. And it all, each and every one of those phrases, and whatever, well, let's stick with English. In English, connotes to any ordinary person highly suspect areas, to say the least. They certainly are not intellectual areas. There is no locale in which you will find, no intellectual locale, by anybody's definition, we'll accept whatever ordinary people would call an intellectual venue, an intellectual source. You're not going to hear terms at all about the perfection of knowledge. Itself is diametrically opposed to all ideas of logic and reason. All scientific view, because there is no such thing as scientific finality. And so the idea of perfection of wisdom, an intellectual might say, well, we're all working on that, certainly. All the sciences, I am personal, we're all attempting to do better. And let's say that someone says, no, it says right here, it's some kind of book about mysticism, it says that people realize a perfection of wisdom. You go, what field is that in? What? You go, mysticism. Like spirituality, that kind of, and they go, oh, well. And that explains it. Because from the ordinary view, there is no such thing as the perfection of wisdom. There is no such thing as an awakening. You tell an ordinary man that, and you say, there's this idea that's been hanging around for thousands of years, and it says that man lives in some sort of less than competent state or less than fully realized state, intellectually or consciously, and it's almost like a dream, and there's something that people do or attempt to do, and some people apparently claim to, or history says that they have actually gone into another state, and they said the difference was between like being asleep and dreaming and just kind of groggy and actually waking up in the morning, and an intellectual. You do understand there is no basis for that. It will not compute, period. And it's not anyone's fault. I'm not just using the term intellectual as some scapegoat. I'm talking about the ordinary level of collective intelligence of humanity. If that were true, then ordinary people have wasted their lives intellectually. The person that I described that has gone through schooling, continues to do so, enjoys it, can say with validity. My fictitious man can say, well, I'm 65 years old, I'll read at least 3 nonfiction books a week. I go to lectures. I attend museum openings. I try to keep an open mind. My mind is as nimble, as open to new ideas as it was when I was younger. I work at it. And I'm telling you that can be a valid telling of his situation at that level. If that be true, then he would also have to admit, if he took the idea of some sort of perfection of wisdom or some sort of awakening, what you're saying is, well, you have spent these 65 years, no matter how admirably, no matter how nice the degrees are and how well respected you are, you have by and large wasted that. If you were trying to increase your wisdom and understanding, which you would go, well, yes, I am. And he said, well, according to these kind of reports and these kind of literature, that there are people who say that the ordinary state of consciousness, and they do not make any distinction between the educated and the uneducated. It just says that man's normal state, compared to what some people have been, could be, is the same as kind of being asleep or in a minor daze, groggy, and suddenly wake up out of a sleep. You understand the direct inference, if you accepted that as being well-founded. An ordinary person has wasted 65 years because all they have done is rearrange their dreams, if that is a valid description. If the ordinary state of being intellectually alive, the ordinary state of personal awareness, personal consciousness, if it can be so drastically altered as to make your ordinary state appear to be a sleeping, a dream, compared to, then all you have done for the 65 years of attempting to feed, nourish, cherish, prop up, patch up the mind, you have wasted your time. You have simply played around with dreams. You have in some way been able to get into your own dream world and have some effect over it. But you're still in that state. Out of hand must rejected that be. The mind cannot deal with it. Life would fall apart, and etc. Why do the stories persist? Again, I might point out, some of you should be obvious, but now that I was playing a little part in making up a nice, intellectual, sophisticated man talking about awakening and perfection of wisdom, and if you were watching the little way I did it, that talking about awakening, and I was doing the part of the educated man, he went, or the perfection of wisdom, and him doing like, well, what? And then I explained it. But the truth is, if he is that educated, he has read such terms, at least in undergraduate school, probably in philosophy 101, in history 102. It is right there. It is in books, and they read right through it. And they do not notice it. You cannot read, for instance, in the Western world, anything about Plato without running across the very thing. You cannot read anything about just the basic, archaeologically conceived history of Egypt. It's just right there. You just read right through it. And certainly no one, if you could be aware and be under the gravity, be under the atmospheric conditions of your forefathers' religion, then anyone who's ever been in church, temple, or a mosque has heard it over and over and over to the point that it's music. But that same sort of person, the guy that I played out his part, that now has several graduate degrees in philosophy and physics and all sorts of areas, and if someone tried to talk to him about the idea of a state of consciousness that was so drastically removed from the standard as to be comparable to a comparison between being awake and then being asleep, and him go, what? And of course, then, remember the way I took it the first time, well, I took it on a little further for then you describe it. You never read anything about metaphysics or anything, and then they dismiss it. But to treat it as though they never heard it is fallacious. You understand? Because this man, I don't care, he could have grown up in the most secular of religions. He could have grown up as a Unitarian or an Episcopalian or anything. And he has heard this all of his life. But you never hear it anymore, simply background music. The idea is there, and yet if you present it to ordinary people, point blank, for whatever reason, that if you if we label these tapings, serious show on the matter of mysticism. And especially if I'd play along a little bit, or if we had somebody here with a turban or a robe. But just the title, if it flashed on first, a survey or a course, that'd sound better, a course in modern mysticism. And you just said that out front. Then anything that you mentioned after that, to an average person, to an average, educated, sophisticated, sane person, if they, for any reason, stayed tuned in, after that, all of it lies somewhere between suspect and laughable. That it's just dismissible, just on the surface to say mystical, because that has nothing to do with logic. That has nothing to do with education. That has nothing to do with reason. Because if they knew anything about mysticism, or if I opened up each show giving a brief, just read from a dictionary, definition 1 or 2 of mysticism, they go, oh, and they dismiss it. Because what it obviously is some sort of divine revelation. The whole idea of instant insight, but divine revelation in some way, that just a guy, that they're people. I'm using now an ordinary intellectual, an ordinary person's mind. They will hear that, and you give them at all a description, at all, just a historic one, that it's people who have tried all sorts of things. Let me go ahead just a minute and play both parts. And if the man, this average, sane, decent, educated person, went, well, what do you mean instant enlightenment or just instant insight? How? I mean, what happens? Is it a lottery number? How do you get in on it? And you say, well, there are all sorts of methods. They've been written down, they're passed around, but there are many of them written down. And you could even point out to him, we can get off the track again right for a second. You could even point out to him the Catholic Mass, the rituals in the Greek Orthodox, all the services in temple, just everything. It's right there. You could look at it, and if you realize there has to be something behind this besides a physical ritual, and if you knew how to interpret it, it would be something else. The Catholic Mass is not the Catholic Mass, and it has nothing to do with the reality behind Plato's shadows on the cave wall, behind the words, the rituals. Of course, that's invalid to say it has nothing to do with it, as you know it has something, but the validity of it is not tied to the Catholic Church, to Christianity, to any religion, to anything spiritual. It is tied directly to the attempt to expand one's consciousness. But back to my fictitious character and myself talking to him. And I said, well, there are things that people do. They sit around, they try to meditate. There are people who dance, there are people that change their diet. But let's say meditate. They try and sit and focus their mind. And he says, and you're saying that this superior knowledge, this understanding of what life is, just comes upon some people. And I said, well, that's all the reports. I mean, it just says it comes on them. Sometimes, some it does and some it doesn't. And he said, in this perfection of wisdom, this understanding of the secret of life, you're saying that when it does happen, even though a man may have been sitting there and going through whatever the apparent required procedures were, that just one day it just hits him. And I go, yeah, that's what it all says. So, I mean, he could be doing it for a week, well, as far as I know, or 20 years, but you're saying that he could just start doing it within a week or 2 weeks or a year. I said, well, there are reports of that. Look what he's faced with. And I don't mean this as a process of logic. I'm just doing this to try and get you to see the way that the human nervous system is tied into the collective network of what life wants out of man. He is faced then with, reminding you again, this is not a matter of logic, this is not a matter of psychological rationalization that the man sits there and has to weasel out of it so that he doesn't feel like he's wasted his life. He can't even go as far as I'm going by playing his part. But that's the way it would seem. That if he thinks, wait a minute, I have spent all of my life, I have 3 graduate degrees, I am respected, I've done this and that, I have this kind of investment, and you're saying that there is a superior knowledge to that gained at Harvard. You go, well, that's what everybody says. And they can almost hear that, ordinary sane people. You can't push it, because everyone knows. They know that just because you get a degree, they don't think about it, but they will admit it, just because you get your PhD in philosophy from Harvard, from Cambridge, which theoretically represents or signifies that you represent the combined collective knowledge of the institution, which is what a doctorate supposedly represents. Of course, everybody knows you don't know everything that But that's what it represents, the highest possible recognition by that collective institution in that field. But any sane person, if you did it in a non-judgmental manner, if you ask him, say, all right, no offense to education, but when they handed you your PhD in philosophy, yes, and I'm sure you were delighted, yes, when they handed it to you, did you instantly understand the secret of life? You know, certainly not. Well, did you instantly understand all the questions? It was all the questions you had. I mean, because anybody who will pursue philosophy, the major in philosophy, it's a matter of questions, and bring up questions and pondering them and reading what other people pondered. So it's beyond any doubt that he had questions about life, and things that he found curious, puzzling, very interesting. And if I said, well, at the time they handed you your degree, read out your name, and they shook your hand, the president of the school, the university, and said, congratulations, Dr. So-and-so. Did you then, or within a few minutes when you got off the stage, did the questions that you had, did they begin to clarify themselves? Did anything happen? And the answer is no. That's what he's faced with. Remember, this is not psychological rationalization on any individual's part, because they're not even aware of this. And I don't mean that some subconscious rationalization, because they could not even hear what I'm saying. They would have already turned on something else, turned me off if they were here in person. But you understand, they have spent that length of time, and now they're confronted with this possibility, this proposal, that there are people who sit around perhaps a month, a year, who knows what. Even if it was 12 years. If it took him 12 years, what if you say, all right, it seems to be that most people, the average is it takes 12 years to reach this state, if you reach it at all. But it takes 12 years. So then he'd feel like, well, we're on even footing. Mm-hmm. Except then, it was like the 12 years, he got his diploma, and all he got was something to hang on the wall, and a better job, maybe, and a title. And this inference is that these other people, when it does happen, at the end of 12 years, at graduation day, is bingo, instantly. No school, they didn't go anywhere, no study, no test. They suddenly understood everything. Mm-hmm. Life could not hold itself together. Human life under that condition. I just want you to understand, it's been kicked back and forth 1,000 of years verbally, it is impossible for any ordinary, I'm just talking ordinary, that infers no negative characteristic, any ordinary, sane, educated, just any ordinary person. I keep throwing in the rest, I mean just any ordinary person. It is not physically possible, and I'm speaking specifically in the neural system of man, for them to hear, that is, accept, for them to hear, to take in, and actually hold the idea that the mind, which is their mind doing all I'm describing in the last 15 seconds, for it to hear the other things will be known that this thing will never know. And an ordinary man, at least once, when he hears this, and maybe more than once, when he hears it, he will momentarily sense, I'll just call it that, a validity to that. You understand what I'm saying? I'm not trying to shave words to death. An ordinary man will hear that kind of idea in the right conditions, the temperature, the humidity be just right, meal be just right. He can hear that, and it will momentarily strike quite ordinary people that it's true. So fast, so far outside the ordinary mentation that they do not even comment internally to themselves. They don't think it's true. They don't say, by God, that could be true. Because if it's going to stay in their awareness long enough to make any comment, it's going to be, oh, come on, it's going to be something negative, it's going to be something dismissive. But it can happen so fast in an ordinary person. What I'm saying is, they know it's true. How about that, just between you and me? They know that it's true. But it gives a whole new definition to the word brief. Well, understand, those of you that now have had some experience, it is so brief, it is too brief for the mind to comment on. Because if the mind comments on it, then it's got it under control. As I said, because it will dismiss it. If it has any comment of the idea of some instantaneous perfection of knowledge, some instantaneous understanding of what's going on, an enlightenment, an awakening that just, when they hear, which I'm telling you is a fact, well, you know it should. that ordinary people can momentarily, under right conditions, they hear that and they know it's true. But we are talking extremely brief. The fact being, the proof being, if you want to look at it that way, that it is too brief for the mind to comment thereon. Conversely, if it is not that brief and the mind does comment on it, it is not positive. It cannot be, because the mind must dismiss it. It is anathema to the mind. It is insanity to the mind. If you start looking at a higher state of consciousness, let's call it that, an awakened state of consciousness, it is the opposite of the mind. It is an opponent of the mind. It is the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, to the mind. So if the mind hears what I'm saying and does what I tell you as a fact, that ordinary people, quite ordinary people, can momentarily hear this and they know it's true, it is too momentary to do them any good. Well, you should have already seen that. The point being, if it's so brief and momentary that the mind does not comment on it, the mind obviously can't use it. It becomes like something that you know and you don't know. And I'm not trying to play cheap Zen with you, but some of you know what I mean. So here we have, what I want you to see is the idea that of mysticism, the idea of an awakening, of another state of consciousness, by no means physically possible can it be peddled, can it be promoted, can it even be presented to ordinary minds. Because if it is at the coldest theoretical level, such as a definition in a book, it will immediately be followed up by a way out. Well, spiritual. Oh. It is also, as long as we're there, you might notice, although I've taken pains to try and disabuse anyone from thinking that I attack religion, you might also recognize right there for that second why the publicly remembered, and I'm not questioning, I'm not commenting, but those who have been publicly, historically remembered and claimed to be mystics, why, to varying degrees, they all are reported, or were reported to have been, in some way, anti-religious. Outside of religion. They do not have to be overtly anti-religious, but the point is, by historical recollections of matters mystical and men supposedly mystical, any comment they had about religion was always on the basis of saying, well, it is not what I needed, it is not what a real, someone seeking another state of consciousness will find nourishment therein. They dismiss it. So in a sense, they are opposed to religion. Now, simply, that was another sidetrack to point out to you why that is so, why that occurs. When you have extracted, even verbally, when you have, which I mean at the mental level, in your own mind, when you have extracted, or able to extract, the idea of spirituality from mysticism, and my intention for the last 35 minutes is to bring you to the point that you'd see in some way that spirituality, in its use vis-a-vis the mystical, is used as a lever of dismissal. Now, spirituality has, the term itself has a much better track record, much better public approval than mystical. But it's not normally seen as such, but the term spiritual is used as a kind of bludgeon to the mystical. Once you understand what the mystical actually represents, to say that something is spiritual is to dismiss it. I mean, if you once called it mystical, and then you say, well, but we're talking about matter spiritual here, or you bring in the matter spiritual, it then dismisses the idea. It overrides it. Put it to you another way, I guess that got a little cloudy, but all of you seem to understand this, the validity. A priest, a rabbi, the pope, cannot be a mystic. I don't mean that the individual can't be or doesn't want to be, but one of them must take precedent. If you're going to be religious, that is spiritual, which is what it amounts to in the everyday world, you cannot be mystical. Which also, if you want to look at history again, I'll point back out why there are so many, and I don't mean just Jesus, because the story didn't survive in a particular form, the one I'm about to use, but the other religions, and a few in Christianity, but they're harder to unravel verbally, of the number of people who have been put to death because they said to varying degrees that they were God, which always attracts a crowd or gets somebody to try to put you away. But I would analyze it for you. I'll go ahead and say further what they were saying. This is history, again, that is the ordinary intellectual level of humanity collectively. They put words back in some mystic's mouth, and they say, well, the history went so-and-so, and he found a guy a hand, and they tried to talk to him, which are all variations up to that point of Jesus' trial, Socrates' trial, Buddha's discussion with his Hindu teachers, his Vedic teachers. But it all gets down to the point that finally he just dismissed the whole thing, whoever they're talking about. And they said, well, just tell us the truth. You keep inferring, or people say that you know what's going on. You never come here to the temple. You don't attend our services. You just don't seem to participate in the spiritual life. And yet there are people around, all sorts of young people or other citizens who take you to be some sort of paradigm of spirituality. How can this be when we don't ever see you here? And then history will say, well, and he stood up and he says, well, it's time for me to tell you the truth. I am God. Yeah. That's an old story. Surely some of you have read it, and it still goes on now. But even people who are looked at a priori as being perhaps somebody extraordinary, but they finally just went too far and said, well, I am God. If we're taking history in all possible ways, now I'm slipping in on you. I gave you the first one without my comment. Now I'm slipping in on you what I know myself. That's not what anybody said, if such a person got and said anything. But that was the only way they could translate it, because what they were saying, whether they said it overtly, what they were representing is they did not have to be part of the spiritual community. They did not have to pursue God at that time. Not because they were God, that's meaningless. It's because they knew the secret. They were awakened. They were enlightened. And so what are you going to call that if you're an ordinary spiritual person? Whenever it got through and garbled, and even right at the time that happened, somebody there in the court, and went, what did he say? What was that? And someone went, well, he said it was God. I didn't hear that. Oh yeah, trust me, that's what he said. Oh, he tried to say something else. He was trying to get around, but he said it was God. Case closed. String him up, burn him, throw him in a pit, put him away. That's the reason I went around that, is to show you that spirituality, the common collective institution being religion of whatever kind, but spirituality is used as a way to cloak, to smother, to override mysticism, to dismiss it. A mystic, Sufi X, that they now say in 960 AD, after apparently giving all the local Muslim institutions and the culture, that they decided he was a problem, that he was engaged in some sort of nefarious revolutionist activity, and they weren't sure what, and that there were people now collecting more and more around this guy, and the people would show up here from India and Chicago wanting to talk to him on a spiritual basis. And we have never seen him in a mosque. His mother said she brought him once when he was 5, but we've never seen him. He hadn't written any books. He doesn't stand up and says, yes, I am a faithful Muslim, or I'm a reformed Muslim. He never says anything. Now think about this. I would like to suggest that you people also begin to understand that force is force in life. Activity is activity, and there is no difference between religion at that level and politics. And so the same thing would happen politically, that a king would get concerned. But in no ordinary minds take it to be something else altogether. So he would very likely, according to history, have ended up in a clerical court. I mean, a secular court. Clerical court. He would end up before the religion of his time. But it's the same thing they would look at as being an attempt to overthrow the king. In this case, the king being if there was a head Muslim, if there was a Pope of Islam. And so they bring him in. And what he represents, no matter what he says, and Jesus being one of the variation stories, saying nothing, which ends up serving the same purpose, as you notice, taking the story. He didn't have to say anything. They went with last chance. So if you think, well, there was something going on, they were going to kill him anyway. Don't look at it literally, but it didn't matter. But look back to my fictitious story of Sufi X, and they bring him in. And rather than say nothing, let's say that he does finally say something. And I'm not even going to say what, because his existence already said something, whether he opened his mouth or not, or they would not have brought him there. The collective reality, local conditions, would not have brought him into the hands of the court. They would not have brought him to the attention of collective humanity at that time to, quote, try him, or to investigate him, to question him. So they bring him in, wanting to know on the basis that he represents a possible usurpation of power, that people are now showing up, people claim that he is some sort of spiritual leader, and he's never said anything. That is very disturbing. Not spirituality. It is very disturbing to the electrochemical balance of the parade. They call him in, and so let's say he says something. I'm not going to tell you what. They read out all these charges, all these suspicions. They put it to him rhetorically. Why is it that people are coming all around you? Why is your reputation even now beginning to equal that of the Pope of Islam, our finest religious, respected leaders? Your reputation, now we hear your name as often as his. How do you explain this? And we never see you. You're not part of the establishment. We don't even know what you believe. What did you say for yourself? And let's assume he says something. I'm not going to say what. He just says something. That's where the people sitting there taking court records, writing down history, is when one of them will go, what did he say? No one say, he said it was God. And when I say I'm not going to say what he said, I'll go this far. He didn't say that. You understand? He just said something. Right there in open court, we'll assume. And one of them says, what did he say? The official stenographer got to take it down. And the guy next to him, his brother-in-law, the assistant stenographer, or perhaps the Pope of Islam, whoever it was, he says, well, I'm not sure I understood what he said. He said it was God. And the guy might thought, they wouldn't say anything like that. You know, trust me, he said it was God. That is the history of it. Not that there's a conspiracy. That is all the collective mind can make of it. That is spirituality's dismissal. That is the override of the mystical. Because as long as when something now falls into the hands of the spiritual, into the hands of the local level of intelligence, level of consciousness, it is then safe. It has been rendered impotent. It has been neutered. It's been made safe. It's taken out all the vitamins, all the dangerous chemicals. It has been made bland. It has been made palatable. It has been made acceptable. Looked at from a more up-to-date level, it has been made intellectually suitable, because it has been dismissed as some sort of kookyism, which is easy to do. If you're out in public, you know this, we've been through this, if you're at a cocktail party and somebody brought the idea of mysticism or something, ordinary people, and they started laughing at, if they'd seen this show, or if they'd anything, you would be slipping. You would be falling into your own mini stroke to defend it. Because you can't defend it. From the ordinary view, it is kooky. Intellectual people might try, if they were still fairly sober, to rise above the level of calling it kooky. But the point is, they can dismiss it, because it cannot be possible. There cannot be possible, even if they hear the description, read it, or ask a mystic, or ask someone who was talking, like I played both parts, and saying, you're telling me that you say that there's supposed to be reliable history, and even up to date, perhaps, of people suddenly going, whoa! And they're calling it like an awakening, or such other level of consciousness that everything you always wondered, all the questions, everything you just answered, you understand things at a level that's just indescribable. And I go, well, it says it. Yeah, there are records like that. You understand that is absolutely unpalatable. And it's not because of their stupidity. It is not because of a conspiracy. It's not because of a curse that God has placed on man. It's not because that these few people who have been referred to as those who reached enlightenment or those who awaken to a new level of consciousness or those who achieve the perfection of wisdom. It's not that they alone are rightful, intelligent, upright people and everyone else are dunderheads. It's none of that. It's mathematical, it is scientific, it is electrochemical, having to do with the formula I told you of the 2 and 3 running the 2 binary forces that run a 3-dimensional form of reality. And since I used that, I didn't point out that now, but when I say a 3D form of reality, not only this one out here you understand, it's the 3D form of reality in your mind. That you can't get beyond that. Within that context, there is no such thing as mystical. There is no knowledge outside the book. What some of the Sufis used to call the moment. A knowledge outside the book. They even referred to the whole mystical system, as they used to call it before everybody and his brother, I guess, had a Sufi school now, and Sufi classes and YMCAs, but that, well, anyway, they were inferring it was the mystical aspect of Islam was the knowledge of God outside the teaching, outside the Quran. That's what which all this means is still the same thing, is the ability. Something happens in a man's mind, an individual, not a group of people, not a group of Sufis, not a group of Muslims, not a group of Christians, not a group of Kabbalists, not a group of anybody. One man's mind suddenly is transformed chemically, physically. Don't say spiritually, or else it just proves that you're an intellectual, because if you say spiritually, you go, delusions. It is transformed, and what is transformed is his insight is outside the book, outside the intellectual flow of knowledge, outside the normal conveyance of knowledge. It cannot be accepted, it cannot even be seen, it cannot be held in an ordinary mind's consciousness. It's just gone. Which from a mystical view, I've heard certain mystics say that there are aspects of their mind that they wish would just... But I guess that's another story. You know?